So we're going to finish up with this session that I'm going to share with a dear friend, Raymond Tubin, who will take the second half. And the idea was to do something a little different, to talk about technology and talk about high tech and developing algorithms and things that might seem kind of foreign to autism research, but they actually meet autism research, particularly for me in this area of trying to quantify behavior. And you heard it. You heard some of this this morning also in the talk that Alice gave. That there's this problem of how do we discuss symptoms in autism, or I like to think about abilities and difficulties. And when you think about the label that we give autistic children, they actually, they're pretty meaningless in the sense that they're dramatically different individuals who have dramatically different abilities and difficulties. And they do have the two core symptoms of autism in common, but they also come in a variety of different flavors. And the children can be totally different from one another. And so you don't necessarily need technology to measure these two things, and a lot of us are measuring them right now with questionnaires. And you heard a ton of research today that's based on questionnaires that either parents fill out or self-reported questionnaires. And I think it's obvious that kind of data, even though it's easy to do and you can do that at scale with thousands of participants, it tends to be biased. You end up with very gross measures that are, you have to rely on what the person is telling you, and people are not very accurate in telling you about the severity of or the different abilities and difficulties that individuals have. And there's also a bunch of biases, right? Each one of us are more or less optimistic, pessimistic, and so scores can vary because of many subjective reasons. The other big tool that's being used in research that you also saw today has to do with some form or other of clinical observation. You film a child, you meet the child. There's typically some expert who spends an hour with the child and gives you a decision, gives you their subjective opinion, and then gives you some kind of score. It can be through an ADOS assessment or cognitive assessment or further. The idea with wearable technologies, or not necessarily wearable, with a bunch of different types of technologies that I'll show you in the next 20, 30 minutes, is that there might be an opportunity to develop tools. And we're not going to talk deeply about algorithms, but at the end of the day, this is where artificial intelligence comes in, and deep learning techniques, and all sorts of ways to identify specific types of behaviors that are of interest to us. And we'll talk a lot about that, about how do we break down abilities and difficulties into specific things that we want to measure, like social attention and stereotypical movements and a bunch of other different examples. And the idea is, of course, some people come out with dramatic claims that this is going to be a new way of diagnosing autism. That's totally off. The idea is that this is another set of tools that a clinician will use that will give the clinician information that they can incorporate into their decision making. But the big advantage is that all of these are direct measurements, and they're objective measurements of the child's behavior. So when we think about autism, we want to measure not only the core symptoms, right? We've been talking a lot about that, but also of a large number of co-occurring symptoms or difficulties that include ADHD and self-injurious behaviors and language abilities and a lot of things that are not in the core DSM diagnostic criteria. Today I'm going to tell you briefly about these four sets of technology. So I'll say a few words about eye tracking, which is probably the most mature technology. This is the one where there's been the most research to date, at least 15 or 20 years of research. The way you capture the data is pretty well defined, and there's a lot of existing research to rely on. We'll talk a bit about video recording analyses. I'll give you examples from recordings that are performed in ADOS assessment rooms, which is what we do at the Autism Center. And in those same recordings, you also have audio, so you can talk about speech and intonation, right? We pass a lot of information, not necessarily with the words that we're saying, but how we say them, the prosody and intonation of speech. And then hopefully I'll have a few minutes to also tell you about wearable devices and a project that I actually did during a sabbatical. So, just to, the discussion here is about data. So there's a lot of, there's data that is easily accessible that we can record relatively easily from children with autism. Let's focus on that. And from each type of data that we record, we can potentially extract different features or different aspects of that data. So if you're thinking about audio recordings, you could develop algorithms that identify the child's speech and do analyses on that. You could extract environmental noises. You could extract everything that's outside of the child and others who are speaking around them to quantify the language exposure. And if we're thinking about autism as a Ilan has this nice framing of saying that it's a transactional, or so thinking about, and Judah also mentioned it in his talk today, about the development of the child within the framework of the environment and the family. So measuring the environment is something that we rarely do in autism research. That's underexplored. So I'll start with eye tracking. This is also a bit of a comic relief. You'll be able to, some of you have seen this. I apologize if you've already laughed at my daughters. But here are my two daughters. This is already 7, 8 years old. But this movie is the cornerstone of eye tracking research at Ben-Gurion University. I should tell you that each point, that's not what I wanted. Sorry, let's move it here. Each point here represents the gaze position of a single child. What you're looking at here are 10 children. The green points are autistic kids. The blue points are control children who do not have autism. And this is where they're gazing. These are the gaze positions throughout as they're watching this 90-second movie. And you'll see that this is a common social interaction in our house. You can tell me who's boss at the end. And you can notify social services if you want, because daddy's just sitting there holding the camera while this is happening. And then mommy comes to save the day. Okay. So there are many different variations of these kinds of movies that have been shown to autistic kids and adults throughout the years. And the kind of questions that have been asked are do autistic children look at this kind of stimuli the same way as typically developing children? And right, we all know that one of the basic examples that people often describe autism, they say that eye contact is one of the initial difficulties. And here you have, so when you talk about eye tracking and these kind of social stimuli, then children with autism tend to look less at faces, even though you see that the green dots are during most of this movie, were on faces. But you should note that in order to understand this social interaction, you don't necessarily always look at the face. You might want to look at the hand location, and there are different parts in this interaction where you need to do that in order to understand the social information. Right, so if autistic children, this is called social attention. If autistic children have less social attention, we can measure that by looking at these gaze positions, and I won't get into the details of how that's done mathematically, but I think it's easy to understand. So last year, 2 very big studies from Ami Klin and Warren Jones in the Marcus Autism Center, who are probably the leaders of this kind of research in the world. They came out with data from over 1,000 children who walked into pediatrician offices to get screened for autism. And they brought this refrigerator-looking device into those offices, and they had the teams there put the children in this car seat and present the children with a set of movies that were about 12 minutes long. All of these kids were about a year and a half old. And they came out with this data showing that both this is the, these are two different cohorts. One is an exploratory, exploratory set of kids where they're developing the algorithm, and this is their way of testing the reliability and showing that it actually works on a bunch of other kids. And so you see 1,000 kids across these two data sets where these are ROC curves, receiver operating curves, and the fact that the point is so close to the top left corner tells you that they're identifying here over 80% of the children with autism while making very few mistakes about neurotypical kids. So about 10% of the neurotypical kids are accidentally marked as autism, but not the rest. And not only does this algorithm do a good job of classifying autism and controls, what's even more impressive is this part, where you see these correlations between different parts of their algorithm. So this is a social disability index, and you can see how it's correlated with the ADOS score. So you could potentially predict the ADOS score from the eye tracking from analysis. And not only that, you could also predict with some accuracy their cognitive abilities, and which is here, and their verbal abilities, which is in the middle. And again, you see this both on an exploratory data set and a replication on a very large group of children. And that's really what you want to see when you're developing a medical device. And that's why they've been awarded FDA approval now. So this is a legitimate aid to autism diagnosis now in the US. And the concept is, and they've now reduced the refrigerator to a tablet-looking like device. The child comes in, and the idea is that this is used to prioritize which children go more quickly into the diagnosis to shorten the waiting list and so forth. And we think about this technology, the next step forward is using all sorts of new commercially available solutions to do this kind of eye tracking, even with your iPhone or your tablet at home. And there are companies working on developing solutions that would actually, where the parent is the customer, and you would get some kind of report or score from a tool like that. So that's eye tracking. I just want to say one other thing. You could also utilize this to see how social attention is changing over time and whether an intervention is working, but that hasn't been explored so far. Okay, I'm going to shift to another technology, which I hope you'll find even more interesting, which is video analysis. And this is work that we're doing here with collaborators from computer science and cognitive science, and Liora and Tal are the two students who are managing this. We have a big repository, one of the biggest in the world, actually, of video recordings from ADOS and cognitive assessments. They look something like this. This is a cognitive assessment, and that's an AD. You actually already saw this ADOS assessment if you went to Moran's talk. Right, so there's typically one child in the room, that's important, and there are multiple adults. And then we can take these videos and run a bunch of AI magic and identify the child, separate them from the adults, and extract their skeletal movements. And that's what you're seeing here. This is just, 4 or 5 years of work, and you can do this. But this opens the road to doing a bunch of really interesting stuff, right? Because now you have the frame by frame, you have a really detailed description of the child's movements in the rooms, and you can take this and do research in multiple different directions. You can look at everything from their posture and their actual movement kinematics, their motor control, how clumsy they are, all sorts of measurements like that. I'll show you 2 examples of looking at facial expressions and identifying and quantifying stereotypical movements. You can look at hyperactivity. That's just by analyzing the child themselves. If you look at the interaction between the child and the others in the room, it gets even more interesting potentially with thinking about how to identify moments of joint attention and synchrony and touching and where the child is relative to others, and the child is often free to move in the room and do things differently. So that's where this kind of research is going. And I'll show you one example of a project that we just published recently where we spend a lot of time looking at these videos and identifying repetitive movements. So it's a long story on how you define a stereotypical movement and a repetitive movement and what is considered clinical and what is not, because children who normally develop also do a lot of repetitive movements and it's not clinical, right? But what we did is we trained a group of undergraduate students to identify a variety of stereotypical movements. You see them listed here using this software that we built for them, where they're looking at the child from 4 different angles and marking events where they think that a stereotypical movement happened. And they categorize them according to this set of categories. They're the very common hand flapping movements, jumping, tapping, toe walking. Notice that the biggest category here is other, because a lot of the stereotypical movements are actually difficult to put in a single category. So things like a child rotating their yarmulke on their head in circles, a child that goes to the same place and touches a wall repeatedly. So all sorts of examples like that of more complicated movies that are difficult to pin down. We took all of that, so we ended up with a library of also 3 or 4 years of work, a library of 7,300 different stereotypical movements. We do a bunch of AI magic. We train models, deep learning models, with the actual video segments to identify these kind of behaviors. And then we end up with an algorithm that scores. We feed it raw video, and it scores. It's a sliding window that scores whether a stereotypical movement exists in this window or not. And that's what you see on the top right here. And you can see this example of one assessment where you'll see this increase in the algorithm's decision, and you can see the beginning of a stereotypical movement. Okay, so this is what the algorithm actually sees, so we can actually maintain privacy here pretty well as well. Okay, and then the end. And here's another example of a totally, notice that the movement is totally different. Now it's going to be jumping and hand flapping. Okay. And toe walking, that you'll see in a minute. And also some jumping. Okay, and what we get out of this is the ability to quantify. What we're really interested is in getting to a situation where you give us a recording of the ADOS assessment and we'll tell you how much time and how many events there were of stereotypical movements so that we can determine whether their prevalence for this child. So here you see the algorithm identified movements versus the manual annotation that people actually looked. This is the number of stereotypical movements per minute, and this is the actual percentage of time, which also takes into account their length. And you can see that we're doing a pretty good job at this. And so the next phases of this research is also to do longitudinal research and see how this changes over time and basically characterize the development. And this is something that, if you think about the ADOS assessment, right, you currently have one item where you basically note where there are stereotypical movements or not. So quantifying this whole area of behavior is something that is very difficult to do for a human and could much more easily be done by an algorithm. Okay, I'm going to rush a bit and show you just a few examples. There are multiple algorithms that you can use for identifying facial expressions. These two are commercial algorithms. You can buy them. About $5,000, I think. PyFit, you get all of this for free, which is why we like it even more. And so these algorithms identify a face in the image and track particular facial landmarks throughout the video. And what you can do with this is identify different facial expressions. The common set are 6 facial expressions that are common in the literature, but you can expand that. And so here in an initial project, we actually looked just at the quantity of facial expressions that happen during an ADOS between, and these are facial expressions that the child is expressing. These are all verbal children from modules 2 and 3, so they're sitting in front of the clinician and facing them. You see that the 3 different algorithms actually give you different results because some of them are more generous than others in identifying what a smile is, which is here in happiness, or what a frown is, which is sadness. You can see that kids particularly smile during the ADOS, and they don't get that angry, which is good. But what was really interesting in this project was that when we compared neurotypical kids to controls, despite the differences across algorithms, regardless of which algorithms we used, we didn't find any differences in the quantity of facial expressions. And so this is driving us to look at other parts of this data that tell us about the quality, about how they're smiling, how they're frowning, and what context they do this in. And for that, we actually need to analyze the shape of the face and the action units that are being expressed. All right. I feel like I need to wake you up. Let's.
וואו, איזה תפריט, גם גלידה, גם מיקס תפוזים, גם גלידת שוקולד, אוכל, אז רגע.
לא, גם גלידת קצפת.
וואו, גם גלידה עם קצפת. טוב, שלום, איפה המוכר?
Okay, whoever recognizes the clinician wins 100 shekels.
שלום מוכר.
לא.
אפשר לקנות גלידה?
לא, אני כאן.
Okay, so what you now just heard is a part of the audio recording that comes along with the video from the ADOS assessment. And you heard Michal interacting with the child, and what you see up here is on the top is actual audio content, and below you can see us identifying the different speakers. We actually still do this manually, but there's a good reason to believe that next year or two we won't need to do that anymore. And here you can see differences in pitch between Michal and the child. And this is actually a project that we've done with folks from biomedical engineering of going deeply into the acoustic structure and the prosody of speech of kids who have autism. There's a whole other project we haven't got into, which is what they're actually saying in the language content. Both of these should be different in autism, right? And indeed, when we look at a variety of features that are common in this world of speech processing, we find that kids with autism, well, in this project, we only included kids with autism, and we looked for a relationship between these features and their autism severity according to the ADOS. So we started out with about 70 kids where we trained the model and then tested. We always train the model on independent children from those who we test the model on. And what we're constantly teaching the model here is how to predict or estimate the ADOS scores, and then we compare the model's estimation according to the actual ADOS scores that Michal gave the kids. And so this is a competition for the model to learn Michal and all the other clinicians who are doing ADOS assessments. And you can see that in this small group, we did a good job, but there's always the risk of overestimating our success. And so we brought in another whole other group of kids who had 2 ADOS assessments 1 or 2 years apart and looked at the model's ability there as well. You see that correlations are weaker, but still highly significant. And the fact that there's any correlation here, I think, is super interesting because we're using a very narrow part of the child's behavior, just their speech, to try and estimate something very broad like an ADOS score. And what's particularly interesting is that the model was specifically successful with estimating social affect scores and not RRB scores. And that tells you something about the features that we're looking at. You could imagine features that are associated with echolalia and other parts of speech that would be indicative of RRB scores, but we didn't do that here. We can estimate crying and screaming and identify that. So if you're thinking about quantifying tantrums and irritability and things like that in an ADOS assessment, that's also accessible. Yeah, and I think that I'm going to, well, I'll take 2 minutes to tell you about wearable devices. So everything I've shown you up until now has been in the clinic, right? So you could potentially take those advances and move them to video recordings that are performed at home with tablets and with the eye tracking. That's definitely being done. But another type of technology that's already set up to work in the participant's home remotely at scale, where you can just mail devices out and everyone can set them up, is in this area of wearable devices. So I assume that 90% of the people here have a smartwatch that's measuring their heart rate and step count, and you might already be obsessed with looking at that. What we did in this project, this was during a sabbatical at the Simons Foundation, was to utilize 3 devices simultaneously in autistic children, and the goal was to focus on their sleep, to try and understand sleep difficulties, which are very common in autistic kids. About half the families report severe sleep problems. Although I see that Yuval, Rimon's son, is sleeping very nicely during the lecture, so no problem there. And so the 3 devices are a smartwatch that measures heart rate, step counts, electrodermal activity, which tells you electrodermal activity is skin conductance, like GSR, galvanic skin response. It's used for lie detection and for identifying stress. Whenever we're stressed out, we sweat a little bit and the conductance increases. We used a Dream device to measure EEG, raw EEG at home. Pretty unique device. And then this Withings mat is something that goes under the bed and starts working whenever you step into the bed and monitors your movement. So it can tell if you're restless or not or sleeping or not.
This research is still ongoing?
What's that?
It's still ongoing?
No, the research is done and the data has been released last week. So I'll tell you about that in a second. All of these devices work with apps that you put on a phone. So we basically sent this package with the cell phone, 3 devices, to families living as far as Alaska even. All this data transfers continuously to the servers at the Simons Foundation, and then you have this ability to just sit in your office, put your feet on the table, and just look at all this data streaming in, and you feel like you're earning your pay with like passive income, right? You're constantly gaining more and more data, and it's just flowing and growing. And indeed, this is maybe one of the fastest projects I think I've ever done. Within 9 months, we collected data from 102 families, and we specifically looked for families where there was one autistic child and one non-autistic sibling. These were all 10 to 17-year-old kids, so adolescents. Because the headband is a bit big, it doesn't fit younger kids. And we recorded each one of them on average for 18 or 19 days. And just think about that in contrast to how we usually do science, right? When we study sleep in a sleep lab, we bring a child in for a single day. They go to some strange, weird environment. People plug a bunch of cables on their heads. And that's the golden standard for studying sleep. And if you think about an autistic child, that's right, they're in this very uncomfortable situation, that's very unlikely to represent their sleep at home. And so here you have much more representative data over extended periods of time with weekdays and weekends and so forth. Won't go into all the details, but there's a lot of really deep, including actual EEG data where you can look at sleep cycles. That's what you're seeing here in these humps. And you can look at sleep architecture and what stage the child was in. You can do this over multiple nights and replicate your data. At the end of the day, if you look at the basic sleep properties, could say we were a bit disappointed that there weren't that big, that we didn't find sleep differences, between the autistic kids and their siblings. Definitely not in total sleep time or awakenings during the night. The only thing where there was a difference, and also not something huge but significant, was sleep onset latency. So it takes the autistic kids longer to fall asleep. And part of the story gets more complicated because 31% of the siblings have ADHD, which is also highly correlated with sleep issues. And so there's a lot more digging to do here, and some of these kids are on medication, and so on and so forth. But okay, we can jump over that. So to summarize, these are the more developed technologies, what I've shown you here today, the more mature technologies. There are additional things that people are talking about, but the idea when you think about all these technologies, don't think about each one of them independently on their own. The idea is that this is a toolkit that you would end up, where you would end up developing a whole host of measures, and you would want to collect all of these measures from each individual to create a psifas, right, a picture of their abilities and difficulties. And ideally, the longer you can do this at home remotely, the better, because you can look at the reliability and you can look at the context of where the difficulties and abilities are happening, and hopefully generate a lot of meaningful information for personalized interventions and measuring the effectiveness of interventions without bias directly and objectively.